Good evening, everybody. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of The Parent Venture, the nonprofit that brings you the Parent Education Series and tonight's event. We are talking this evening about supporting children through grief and loss with Jaymie Byron from Cara. But before we get started, I want to say if you need Spanish interpretation, we have with us tonight Cynthia Hinestrosa, who will be providing interpretation. There are instructions in the chat in Espanol, and you can also click on the globe icon, and Spanish to hear interpretation in Spanish. We know, especially at the holidays, that this topic, grief and loss in children and teens, is a very important one. And we are honored again to have Jaymie Byron with us tonight. With more than 230 of you registered, we know that this is an important topic. And we also really want to thank her for being here. Tonight's program is sponsored by Sequoia High School Education Foundation, Sequoia Healthcare District, Peninsula Healthcare District, Sequoia High School District, and this organization, The Parent Venture. We are so grateful for your sponsorship. We would not be here without you. So many of you, most of you by now are familiar with the Zoom format, but I just want to reiterate that this is a webinar tonight. So you, the audience, have a couple ways to engage with us. My partner, Bev Hartman, will be putting resource links in the chat. Feel free to use the chat to reach out to us, to talk to everyone, to one another, but we'd like you to put your questions in the Q&A button. Jaymie will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to you, the audience. So we really hope that you have some questions for us. Feel free to put them in anytime during the talk as they occur to you, or if you have something prepared, you can put it in now. Either thing is just fine with us. Again, the event is being recorded. We are grateful to our partners, the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula, who provides videography for our Parent Education Series event. This video will post in a few days to our video library, which is growing. It's a great and free resource for you, parents and caregivers, with more than 31,000 views on our YouTube channel. So let me start by telling you a little bit more about tonight's presenter. Jaymie Byron is a licensed marriage and family therapist and the Director of Community Outreach and Education for Cara. Her work at Cara over the past 8 years has been focused on supporting those in the initial wake of grief. Jaymie manages and maintains the crisis response team for Cara that supports schools, organizations, first responders, and families in the wake of crisis. In her capacity at Cara, Jaymie has extensive experience working directly with clients impacted by and processing the death of a significant relationship. Jaymie is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and she holds an MA in counseling psychology from the University of San Francisco and a BA in UC Santa Barbara in economics and global studies. Prior to her work at Cara, Jaymie served in the United States Peace Corps from 2010 to 2012 in the Dominican Republic. Please join me in a really warm virtual welcome for Jaymie Byron. Take it away, Jaymie.
Thank you, Charlene. I really appreciate that introduction coming forward. And thank you to all the partners that are sponsoring this event as we're making our way into the holiday season and really looking at how we can support children through grief in this time of year. I do want to recognize that this presentation may be a little bit moving or sensitive in nature, so please be gentle with yourselves during this time. I would love to reinforce, as Charlene said, this is being recorded and is available in the video library. So if at any point there is a piece to this presentation or it becomes a little overwhelming, you are more than welcome to access it at a time that's more comfortable for you when it's up in that video library. So just want to put that out there for y'all. I do want to say thank you for having me here. Before I get really started into the material that we have going forward, I'd love to share a little bit about Cara with y'all so that if you need to access support, you know where to go in the wake of grief and bereavement. Cara has been around for almost 45 years. We'll be celebrating the upcoming year. And Cara is a nonprofit that is located in Palo Alto. We are not county-based. We actually are open to the greater Bay Area. So if you live in Santa Clara County, San Mateo County, all the way in Alameda, up in Marin, we are available to support you. We do in-person and virtual services. As you can imagine, this with the recent year and the pandemic, we have had to pivot to virtual. And so we've expanded our reach and outreach for support. We do have some services coming back to in-person, and one that really rings true and is what we're going to be talking about today are our support groups for youth and family. Our youth and family program is available. We are one of the only Bay Area grief agency that is supporting children in person during this time. And if you are interested in seeking out support for your family and your children at this time, please reach out to us. You can connect with us via a phone call or through an online web submission at our website at cara-grief.org. Another available support that I do want to highlight while I have this page up for y'all is our summer camp. We are set to have our summer camp, Camp Cara, that serves school-age children ages 6 to 17. We do serve 18-year-olds if they happen to be a senior in school and they turned 18 during that time, school-aged. And what we do with that summer camp is it's a free 3-day, 2-night summer camp in which we bring together about 90 campers to collectively honor the grief that they've experienced, the death of a loved one or a significant relationship, and really help them not only process and navigate the complex emotions that come up, but normalize the experience in that they get to share fun camp-like activities like rock climbing and zip lining with other kids that get it, that have had a similar experience and can relate to them on that. Those applications will be coming up in January if you are interested or if that seems to pique an interest for y'all. If you have any questions, please write into us and we are more than happy to connect with you and answer any individualized questions pertaining to you and your family. So let's get rolling with the material we have on deck tonight. As I'd like to begin, I'd like to start with this quote from David Kessler, as this is going to be the emphasis of our whole presentation today, and it's this. Each person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint, but what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining. If you take anything from this presentation, please take this: the power of witnessing, of being fully present. And I know how difficult that can be to really the magnitude of someone's loss. The witnessing is where the healing truly happens. Now, when we're working with little ones in our life, children, number one thing that they really need is having the permission to feel and to share whatever feeling is coming up for them. Children, all children actually do grieve. Now, the interesting aspect before we get into how they grieve and understand death and dying is I want to have a little bit of clarification on points. We oftentimes use the words grief and mourning interchangeably, but they're actually two quite different things. The first is grief. Grief is the process of adapting to change involving loss. Notice that I didn't say it's death specific because it's not. Grief is something that we've experienced anytime we have to deal with any loss involved in our life. For example, divorce, separation, incarceration, deportation, immigration, job loss, home loss. Those are 7 very stigmatized examples of things that can happen in someone's life that can evoke a very strong and palpable grief process. It's not death specific, but it's very similar to the grieving that can happen. So grief is one of those processes that we have in our life. It's one that we experience over our lifetime. However, death specifically does have a bit of a different kind of tinge to it. It's different because it can evoke a lot of the fragility of life, in that to be human is to be mortal, which means it has the potential to experience death. Your humanity is based on the fact that everything around you is temporary, and that can be quite scary. And that is why grief in the wake of death really has a lot of questions and doubts that come into it. And so being able to have some basis of understanding of how are we understanding this abstract concept of death at such young ages can help you understand how to intervene and support a child who is grieving during this time. Something to note about grief is a really complex mixture of thoughts and feelings experienced internally. Oftentimes you can't see it on the external side. Oftentimes you can't see how the process is unfolding, but it's an internal experience of emotions that are taking place. And I do want to acknowledge that grief is very natural, it's normal, and oftentimes it's necessary to help us as we transition through all the myriad of what life's bringing forward. Conversely, mourning is that outward expression of grief. It's what we actually get to see. I do want to acknowledge there are people who can grieve and you would not even know that they're grieving because they're not showing an outward expression or a mourning practice that you recognize. What's a mourning practice? Well, it can be anything like a behavior, such as crying. It could be screaming. It could be yelling. It could be talking about the loss and sharing memories. It can often be journaling, which is a very solitude practice. Prayer, if they're from a religious context. Support groups are really, it's an outward expression of creation. Oftentimes, mourning is a version of how we heal, and it's a way that we restructure hope and meaning. Now, mourning is something that we are taught. Grief is something that is innate within us. So children in grief, well, how do they understand grief, and what does grief look like in children? There used to be a long-held definition that children don't grieve, adults do. Their minds are too underdeveloped, and that is just not true. Children grieve, they just grieve differently than adults. As we've learned from children, and as we've seen how they've grown and developed, we've recognized over time that children do grieve. They recognize when there's changes and losses and transitions around them. I will say now, depending on the age of the child, they'll react differently to grief, crisis, and trauma naturally. They'll react differently based on their capacities, based on the coping skills they have available to them, based on their temperaments, and based on their cognitive developmental ability of understanding what has taken place. For this presentation, we'll actually go through 3 of the predominant age ranges and their interpretations of grief. I like to refer to them as littles, middles, and bigs, and it's across the lifeline. You'll notice that the age range I'm going to start with will be about 4 years old, and I want to acknowledge that infants as young as newborns and even neonatals, that they experience a grief process as well. However, for this presentation, we're going to focus on the school age range and start with 4-year-olds, 4 to 5-year-olds, up until about 7. Then we're going to go from 7 to 11, and then we're going to look at our lovely, lovely teenagers to wrap up kind of how that division works for age ranges. I want you to know that at each developmental level or situational challenge, i.e. when we're grieving a milestone, children will re-experience the death in a new way, and they really do need to find new ways to reintegrate the death into their life. I want to underscore here that death isn't something to be solved. It's not something we can fix, but rather it's something to be present to, and it's something that we integrate into our being of who we are. An example of what I mean by a developmental level or situational challenge, I want to use an example here. We'll use an 8-year-old girl. This young, beautiful 8-year-old girl has 2 parents, a mother and a father. And we'll say for this example that the mother grows ill, maybe from cancer, and she passes away. Now that 8-year-old girl is left with her father, and the father says, you know what, I need to get her some support. I need her to help process what it's like to not have a mom. So he sends her to Camp Cara. She makes some really great friends. She learns how to articulate her experience, and she kind of is able to process and integrate that. Now that 8-year-old girl isn't going to stay 8 forever, and eventually she's going to grow up and maybe she'll be 16, or maybe she'll be 25 and decided that I'm going to get married to my partner. And she's getting ready on her wedding day, which is a really situational challenge or developmental milestone for them. And what she experiences, the loss or the yearning of her mother, that grief resurfaces on a big momentous life moment. And she has to reintegrate, what is it like to be a bride on her wedding day without a mom? That's what I'm talking about at developmental levels, as well as situational challenges that can occur when they re-experience a grief process, a grief witnessing, and really identity form. That same girl who was 8 and then 16 with prom, 25 when she got married, maybe is having her first child at 30 and she's becoming a mother herself. And that grief reemerges about having a child and being a mom and not having had a mom with her. That's what we're talking about with this lifelong process that grief happens and how it can be re-experienced and then reintegrated at new developmental and situational challenges. Grief is intertwined with normal developmental tasks. It's something that we've done our whole life and that we've been grieving because we've had to deal with changes and transitions. But with death specifically, a normal developmental task such as a sleep regression or such as having to transition between schools or hitting puberty, it can be magnified. And so when I get into supporting a student or child, we'll talk about how we can actually make creative interventions to support a child who's grieving and also dealing with some new developmental tasks coming forward. So who are we going to start with this evening? We're going to start with our littles, our children who are ages 4 to 6, this cute little range of kiddos. Well, something to think about is, what is a 4 to 6-year-old cognitively doing? What are they understanding in themselves? Well, their ability being developed at this moment is something for intuitive and logical reasoning. These kiddos, their number one question is why? 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 Why do things happen the way that? Why does the sun come up? They are the great questioners of their time. They have an emerging interest in the use of really reasoning that's happening around them. And they really want to know why things are the way they are. Why is a stop sign red? Why is a school bus yellow? How come it's that shape and not a circle? Those are the questions they're understanding what's going on around them. They're constructing orientation in the world. Now, what happens with their beliefs about death is fully not understood as permanent. They oftentimes view it as reversible. The idea of permanence doesn't stay because everything in life more or less has come back. Even when they get dropped off at school or daycare, they get picked up again. So it's not a permanent staying away. When they go to sleep, which is the closest thing that they have in relation to death, they wake up. There's no sense of permanency. Everything is really malleable. Ergo, when they have such an abstract thought, such as death being permanent, they don't understand it fully as so. In fact, they believe sometimes that it could be quite reversible. And that gets reinforced oftentimes in what views and images they have. If you think about some of the magical thinking that occurs with their imaginary play, but also with maybe fairy tales or parables that they're told or stories, a lot of it seems very magical in its way of thinking. And so they basically have a causality in view of death. It's not very linear in a lot of ways. So the reactions you'll see, because things don't seem permanent, that it seems reversible, that they actually do believe that if you kiss the princess, she wakes up, that magical thinking, their reactions are very much in an inquisitive and repetitive way. For example, they will often tell and retell about the death. Now, this can be one of the hardest grief reactions for a parent to witness and also to experience. An example I can give you is we are working with a really sweet 6-year-old girl, and her father had passed away. And the mother had come to us and said, I don't understand why she's doing this. What that 6-year-old girl was doing was she would tell everybody that her dad died. From the bus driver, my dad died. The crossing guard, my dad died. Her teacher, my dad died. She's saying this over and over again. And the mom, that surviving mother, is getting fatigued because it's hard to hear such honest words coming from such a small child's mouth. And she's wanted to know, is this normal that she's telling, my dad died, my dad died, my dad died? And the truth of the matter is that's very normal. Why is that normal? Well, think about, we'll just take the word, we'll take out love, we'll take out died, which is an abstract concept, and let's replace it with another one. Let's use love, for example. Love is not something tangible, it's a felt experience, and it's unique to everybody. But the way we learn our understanding of a word like love is we use it on different people and we get a different feedback loop, a reaction that they have. A little child who's saying died over and over again, what they're doing is they're recognizing when I say died to you or died to you or died to you. I notice that when I say it to you, your eye gets really moist. When I say it to you, your lips get really tight. When I say it to you, you don't even look me in the eye. They're recognizing the palpability of this word and realizing that it has significance and meaning. And so by saying it over and over again, they're learning the meaning of what's the saliency of this word. And so that's why they tell and retell about the death or the specific wording, is they're trying to understand cognitively, what does this word actually mean? What is this for? Oftentimes, there's a bit of confusion and uncertainty because remember, there's that idea of things are reversible. So they may ask repeated questions, or they may make statements such as, mom's taking a lot of time in heaven. When's she going to be back? They view it as if it's like a place in a store, just like they know other places, like a grocery store that people come back from. And so they may have statements that are not necessarily concrete, but seemingly run on, and that wondering sits there. They may start to present with anxieties and fears about others, because if one person leaves, is another person going to go away? Naturally, that's a very linear thinking in that. And they oftentimes will visibly regress or act younger from time to time. So if you had a kiddo who was sleeping through the night, all of a sudden it might be difficult to sleep through the night. They'll regress a little bit in their actions. If you have a kiddo who maybe didn't wet the bed, they might wet the bed this time around because they're kind of reliving or trying to reintegrate a new experience over time. So what happens with this one is they're really working on integrating this permanence. What is permanence and what does it mean? And so oftentimes kids at this point, we'll talk about how to support them, but some of the best supports for these kiddos are really concrete languaging that give them a sense of anchoring and allows them to get some more narrative and traction in how they're working through the unknown. Now, children ages 7 to 11, these kiddos are just starting out to get their independence. I do want to put a caveat on this, even though I have concrete numbers such as 4 to 6, 7 to 11, please you just use your discretion when you're thinking about your own kiddo. You know them best. And so if you have a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old, there's a little gray area. They might straddle both sides of this fence here. So what's going on with the 7 and 11-year-olds? Well, they're really developing this idea of mastery. They're concrete thinkers. They're really realizing that I can move throughout this world and I can create some understanding. I can build things with my hands, or I can actually make a cause and effect by throwing a ball, it bounces off of a wall. They're really creating a lot of mastery, and they're being able to accept some abstract concepts such as time or patience or waiting pieces. So remember when I said 4 to 6-year-olds, their number one question was why? 7, 11-year-olds, their question is how. Well, how? How does that happen? How is that coming to be? That is the question that defines this age range here. And what they're beginning to see is that death, in regards to death and dying, is death is final and universal for others. And they oftentimes may believe that they can escape it by being really good or trying really hard. They really become a little bit more rigid. They may even act as if nothing is bothering them or nothing has happened, because they may have this belief that I can escape this by being really good. It'll overlook me because death happens to bad in a bad way. Death is bad. It happens to bad people. Ergo, if I'm good, the counter to bad is good. It'll skip me. There's a little dichotomous thinking in that. And so they don't hold the gray very well. Oftentimes they perceive the irreversibility and inevitability of death, and they perceive their own mortality. It starts to creep in that they themselves are not permanent. And that can be quite scary for them to realize that they are fragile themselves. And then what instantly happens when they realize I'm vulnerable too, well, I'm going to do everything I can to not be vulnerable. And they'll start trying really hard, or they'll get really obsessive about things that are life affirming or help them feel safe. So reactions you'll see oftentimes is an increased interest in facts and death. Well, if I understand what happened here, I can understand how to outsmart it or not be tricked or duped into a death and dying process. So they'll oftentimes ask a lot of questions, and this age range, more than any other of the age ranges, really want to know the facts about what happened. They really want to understand, well, what is something like cancer? They really want to understand more discreetly, well, how did that happen? What happened if it was a car accident? What happened with the driving? What car were they driving? What color, what make was the car? Those facts give them a sense of certainty, and they help them in their understanding or their belief that they can escape it if they know what happened and they can make different decisions. They really may act like nothing happened or deny that things are different. This comes from ability that, yes, if I don't act as if anything happened, nothing happens, a little bit of denial, but it also comes from this ability to empathize that with a caregiver, for example, if it was 2 parents in a household and one parent passed away, they themselves might think, well, I can't have my other parent, my surviving parent, be emotionally dysregulated. So if I act as nothing happens, they won't be emotionally triggered. Ergo, I'm safer. So they may act as nothing happens to protect the safety and security of the home as well. They tend to show their grief, but you'll always see it a little bit in their play or their behaviors. So they may do it in types of games that they play and being a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more darker in kind of the ways they play game, their make-believe games. They also might start to use humor. Humor is a way to cope with the stress and cope with the anxiety of changes going on around them. And humor really starts to develop at this range, and it can come in the form of sarcasm, and it can come in the form of not necessarily punchline jokes, but they do develop a sense of humor to offset some of the stress that's coming up that they're experiencing. And the last part that's a little bit more tricky as they get more to the 11-year-old and tween age is peer relationships are increasingly more important. They're beginning to see that there are other people, there are peers that they're measured out to. And that is also another reinforcing fact that if they see other kids who both have maybe two parents or siblings or grandparents, and they have maybe lost those relationships, they may act as if nothing's different because they don't want to be felt different or separated from the group. Which rolls into our beautiful section of teenagers. I absolutely love teens. I'll be very honest. Teens are probably my favorite group to work with. And I really want to express that what they're developing in this time is really this idea of who am I? It's identity formation. In psychology, we call it individuation is what's taking place. We want to understand who am I versus role confusion, i.e. what are the characteristics from my family that I'm taking on with me? Such as maybe when I laugh, I have a high-pitched laugh. Maybe I want to change that, or maybe it's a part of my personality and that's fine. Versus the identity they have. So role confusion is, am I taking on the emotional weight or acting older than my age because of what my family dynamic is requiring me, versus what is the identity or what is the caregiving role that I want to take on versus I'm taking on because it's part of the dynamic or there's a vacuum and I'm stepping into that piece. So individuation is really important during this time. Now, remember, I said why for the 4 to 6-year-olds, how to the 7 to 11-year-olds. These guys are who? Who am I? Now, as most teens are, they're very much, all children are, but this group in particular, we like to say they're egotistical, but really what it is what's going on in their brain is their sense of self, that center in which their brain is developing this cognition of me, that kind of self-reflection or self-perception is heightened during this time. A lot of research shows that they're the ones that have a heightened sense of me and feeling like all eyes are on me. They're very sensitive to that because the part of the brain that's developing that recognizes me in relation to others is really growing at this part. And so their sense of self of who they are is really a big part of it. What's really happening during this time is developmentally, they're starting to separate from their parents. And that can be really hard when we're so used to having our little ones around us. But as they get older, they are developmentally separating from parents because they're finding out who their community is. They're doing that identity formation. And so they're testing out, who am I? Am I an athlete? Am I a theater person? Who do I like? Who do I love? How do I identify? And so that separation begins to start because they're eventually on an evolutionary basis needing to have to find their own community to thrive in as they futurely go out to maybe start their own families or their own communities in the future. They reference their peer group almost all the time. And I say this and put this on here because some parents who get contentious with teens, especially teens in grief, they maybe won't like a certain friend group or they may speak against the friend group. And that works counterintuitively because to separate from those friends is almost as if to alienate themselves. So they'll reference their friend group oftentimes more than the parent group. And that can be really tricky in rolling with that resistance that can come up. Their verbal expressions are far more prominent. They have so many more stories to tell. And this is a beautiful thing, but please don't be tricked by how verbose your beautiful teens are. You have teens that can read anything from like Middle English Chaucer and quote Shakespeare so easily, but just because they have a beautiful verbal expression doesn't necessarily mean they understand the salient points that are actually being spoken in things like Animal Farm or 1984. And so while they're able to talk the talk, are they really able to walk the walk? That's still yet to be seen. And sometimes one of the gaps we fall into with supporting teens is we think, oh, they're just little adults. But no, they still have a sense, they still have those childish needs of being seen and heard and being tended to. They won't tell you they need those things, but they definitely do. And so we have to look for those moments of when they're having that vulnerability and being able to reinforce and affirm them in those times. A little bit scary when we think about that teens are most likely taking a lot more risky behaviors. And I'm going to say this very cautiously, but teens They're supposed to take risks. And you may think that's counterintuitive, Jaymie, but the truth of the matter is they are. But it's what kind of risks are they taking? For example, they should be trying out for that sports team, going out for the school play, making that presentation that makes them so nervous. Those are all healthy developmental risks. Those are all ego risks that they're taking because it's testing who am I? The risks as a parent that you may be thinking about are, oh my God, Jaymie, I can't imagine driving, sex, drugs, alcohol. And I want to reframe that. Sex, drugs, alcohol, and driving, those aren't necessarily risks. Those are risky behaviors, but that's not necessarily the risks I'm talking about that teens should be doing. Those are kind of maladaptive techniques that they may be doing to self-soothe or help them numb out due to some experiences that they're having. So if you're seeing an increase in risky behavior, that might be indicative that the child needs a little bit more support. And finally, the saving grace of working with teens or having teens around is their idea of being social consciousness is so much more acute, i.e. they want to be a part of the bigger picture. They really want to find their place in the world. So this is the age range that's going to do the marches, that's going to do the walks, that's going to do the color schemes and the games, the kind of all those pieces that they want to be a part of the bigger picture and be inclusive. These are also the kiddos that are going to probably learn a lot more about kind of one of those social justice issues that can give them some motivation. If they're a teen that's experienced the death of a significant relationship, maybe it was due to substance use, or maybe it was due to a heart attack. They're the ones that are going to do those out of the darkness walks, or the ones that are going to raise funds for an organization that supports the causes of like cancer research. Okay, so how do we support these kiddos through their grieving process? The first thing is I kind of want to walk through Alan Wolfeld's journey through grief. Alan Wolfeld is a prominent member, researcher on children's grief, and he's come up with this idea of 6 reconciliation needs. Now, I want to just let you know these reconciliation needs aren't sequential. They may appear sequential, but it's something that gets revisited time and time again. So one of the things that they need is the acknowledgement, the ability to acknowledge the reality of the death, that being a huge part of it. Is it acknowledged and even talked about in the family part? Embracing the pain of the loss. I want to acknowledge that it is quite painful to grieve. That's not just in your head. It could be physically painful. One of the best studies that came out in our modern time took place in 2014. And the study was done by Columbia University. And you had researchers named Ethan Cross who was trying to figure out, does our body process physical pain different from emotional pain? And what they found in their research was no, our body, our pain matrix cannot distinguish the difference between a broken arm and a broken heart. It processes it all in the same way. And so when we talk about a lost relationship or social rejection, that is actually quite painful, not just on a physical level. So when you really hear, my heart hurts, my feelings hurt, embracing the pain of the loss is very true and very real. Grief is a very physical process in a lot of ways, and it can be quite painful. You have to have opportunities to remember the person who died. And this is significant across the age range. Even when we're talking about young 4-year-olds who may not have the cognitive capacities to hold a memory, they're going to probably need stories retold to them about the person so that they can kind of borrow those memories and those sentiments. Developing a new self-identity, this happens across the gamut, but a self-identity as, who am I as a motherless daughter? Or who am I now as an only sibling now that my brother or sister has died? Searching for meaning, that's a lifelong process. Sometimes they find meaning in an instant, and sometimes it unfolds over the years and decades later. And finally, receiving ongoing support from others throughout the process. Now, support for children and teens, our baseline rule is this: let children teach you about their grief. And this can be incredibly difficult. Death is the ultimate equalizer in that no one knows more about someone's grief experience than the actual griever themselves. And oftentimes as a griever, we don't know what our grief is continuing to teach us. We just need the permission and the space to engage with it over time. And so letting our children teach them about something so sensitive and personal, such as grief, is something that makes us have to be level to their experience and really be open to whatever it may be that they're sharing, even if it's painful as a parent to hear. It may be excruciating to hear your child mimic the questions that are in your own heart, such as, where did they go? Are they in pain anymore? How come they couldn't stay? Those are questions we ask ourselves as adults and we don't have an answer to. And I hope that you will find that it's not necessarily having an answer. It's the ability to ask the question and not be alone in the unknown together. So the first part of letting children teach you about their grief is be honest with yourself about your own thoughts, concerns, and feelings. You might have your own judgments that you're working through, and that's okay. It may be about the situation and reaction, about your own ability to help or serve your kiddo. I want you to know that when you are judgmental towards yourself or others, it's very hard to reach for that tool of compassion. But however, when we are practicing the skill of compassion, we are asking ourselves to sit with suffering. So be kind and gentle with yourself when you're doing so. The first step to letting your children teach you about the grief is being open to the fact that you yourself are going to have your own questions and concerns. Be kind to yourself in this process. I want you to know that children's feelings are their allies. Oftentimes, it's the first sign of communication for them. Grief is far more physical the younger the child is, in that their body is telling them what they're experiencing. I want you to know that as language comes online and as wording and word associations come online, they're able to then be able to talk about things more easily, and they're able to interpret those feelings that are coming up. However, the sensations are very visceral and very real. I want you to know that feelings are neither good nor bad. They may make us feel good, they may make us feel bad, but they themselves are not good or bad. They're simply messengers. They're messengers to tell us what's going on around us, that things have shifted and changes, and we need to adapt. I really utilize work from Susan David. It's kind of what she talked about in emotional agility, when she says that emotions are data points, feelings are interpretation of data, and behavior is data in action. And what she's talking about is if we're able to neutralize this, we're no longer judging the emotions that come up. We're simply experiencing them and allowing some better tolerance as they arise. Another incredible study that came out in 2014, which was a great year for scientific studies in the psychology field, was this one that was done in Scandinavia. And what they did was they were trying to figure out, is there a universal bodily sensation for emotions? And in scanning about 468 individuals, what they found is that we do have a pretty much similar ignition of how our emotions really work within our body when we are emotionally triggered. Anger, we tend to feel it in the fist. We tend to feel it in clenched jaws. One of my favorites, if you're looking at the screen, is disgust, because you could actually see the digestive tract being followed down. It's one of those things that our body has its own language of emotion, and it's very real and very visceral. And when I talk about children are feeling all these things, but they don't necessarily have the words to say, oh, I'm angry. All they have is a clenched fist and a scream that's coming out of their lungs. And so calming it down and letting them realize that your child's behaviors they're demonstrating is a language in and of itself to show you their emotional reaction and their grief. One of the ways to help address a child get a little bit more calm and understanding is having direct and truthful answers. One of the biggest frameworks when we're talking about helping children manage their emotion comes from Dan Siegel's work, when he talks about the name it to tame it kind of methodology. As in, if you're able to label and name what's coming up for you, it no longer has any power because you've tamed it by understanding or giving it a name. This is the same when we're talking about death and dying. When we're able to give an abstract thought or an abstract experience some detail, some language, it helps calm the waters. So direct and truthful answers. Now, I want you to know developmentally appropriate language that matches, and this is key, the cognitive capacity of the receiver. So the child who's receiving it, we have to match how they're understanding things. And respect the emotional severity of the context in which you are responding. We have to understand that we are giving them emotion appropriate language, and we're treating it so as in respecting the individual. We're respecting maybe the relationship that was lost at this time. And so we're matching their cognitive capacity with respect. So I want you to keep in mind your word choice, the tone, and the pace in which you are saying something that allows a child to either appropriately digest. When I talk about word choice, what I'm talking about is using definitive words. It may be incredibly hard to tell a child death, dying, and died. We may want to use euphemisms such as passed away, lost. However, when you use a euphemism, that's a euphemism you've learned over time to help protect your tender hearts. But a child who doesn't understand that lost can also mean died can get very confused. We worked with a child who was 8 years old, and this 8-year-old's dad had died. And he was sitting in our group, and parents afterwards were sitting and talking and mulling around. And two moms, unbeknownst to each other, knowing that their children were listening in, were talking very casually. And one said, "Oh, when did you lose your husband?" And she responded, "Oh, I lost my husband 8 months ago." The boy stopped in his tracks and looked at his mom and said, "Dad's been lost? Why haven't we been looking for him?" And it unraveled so quickly. And that's the importance of using definitive, concrete languaging, and how euphemisms can be really detrimental when they're not fully understood by a child. So as hard as it is to use words such as death, dying, and died, you're actually giving some concrete basis for them, and you're helping them along the way in understanding that this is different than other forms such as past or slept or gone. Remember, I really want you to know that children will ask if they want to know more, and they may ask multiple times regardless of the response. And that could be very tricky that they're asking multiple times, especially when you felt like you met their answer really well. And I want you to know this, it's not the answer, it's the process of looking. It's the ability to search, it's the ability to look and engage with this material at a very slow pace that they're ready for. So it's the process of looking, not necessarily what they uncover, that is helpful for a child to integrate what has happened. Okay. The power of acknowledgement, being able to use words as the I statements. We do enforce with children that they use I statements all throughout, but even as an adult, when you say, "I don't know," or "I would want," or "I need," or "I acknowledge," you're modeling for a child what they can then ask for. A lot of parents will come to us and say, "I don't know what they need." And sometimes I will ask, "Well, have you told them what you need?" "I need a moment here," or "I need some water. I'm going to go get some water because I'm replenished, I'm dehydrated." When you speak like that, you're modeling how to frame out needing, and the younger child can pick up on that wording and they can articulate it themselves. Be very, very cautious about using words that are really well intended, but can limit an individual and really the child's expression, such as "you should, you shouldn't," "I know just how you feel," "Everything will be okay, don't worry, be sad, be cry, be angry, it's all okay here." When we rush to all those things, we don't leave the space for letting a child be able to sit with and build distress tolerance for what is coming up for me in this moment. And so I want you to acknowledge that support of caring adults and peers who respect their grief and allow them to express their feelings to be heard. We really want, especially with older teens, the ability to be available but not intrusive. And so that respectful way of "I'm here if you want to talk or if you need me" is one way to acknowledge and also be respectful of their own process. Providing a range of outlets for the grief is pivotal and important. I like to look at it this way. We look at our three process centers: our mind, our body, and our heart. And so one way to think about it with the mind, playing games and play, by really engaging those problem solving strategies, it gives them a sense of predictability or some sense of control. And they can reenact transition at transitionary times, which are important. Body movement is always helpful, whether it be hiking, stretching, sport, dance. Really allowing someone to have an external environment can provide a sense of control. So if you give them a place to go to, whether it's the burial site, whether it's a hiking trail, they can actively engage in that memory cycle when they're ready. Heart, you can think of creative outlets, whether it's listening to music, creating ones with one's hands. So painting, Zentail, cooking and baking. It's about the intentionality and being open to what's a possibility for them. I'm going to zip through. I have about 1 more minute and I'll open it up to questions. The biggest piece to this idea is giving them choice and expressing and participating in rituals and ways to be involved in memorializing the person who died. Oftentimes we try to shield children from funeral practices or mourning practices because we believe, and this is not unstated, that it's a really emotionally jarring for some kids. And it may be. You know your child better than anyone else. You'll know if they'll be emotionally oversensited. I also want to recognize that if you yourself are going through this grieving process, because it's your relationship too, you might want to bring in some supports so that you can go through your appropriate process and your process to acknowledge your grief, and the child can go through theirs with supports around them. So grief, I really want to acknowledge, is disorienting, and it does mark a lot of losses and change. It does make us feel out of control, and it really does make us feel isolated. So we really want to help somebody feel in control, and we want them to feel a part of community, which is why we bring in added supports. But ways to help them feel in control is to give them some sense of decision-making power. When I work with kids and I have them do a body map in which they have to color where they experience emotions in their body, I oftentimes will ask, do you want to color with crayons or do you want to color with markers? I truly do not care if they color with crayons or markers, but to that child, having a choice of being able to elect what actual art tool they use feels so great. Even though it was so small, to them, it restores a sense of control for them. I do want to acknowledge and echo that routines and stability provide safety and really quell anxiety. I do want to let you know that maintaining routines is incredibly helpful. They just might need to be modified. For example, if they are supposed to unload the dishwasher or fold the laundry as part of their chore, they should be able to do it. You just might need to do it with them. If they're supposed to take the dog out for a walk, you might need to go walking with them. I know it's more time inducive. However, it's about the joining and the unifying for them. I also want to acknowledge for smaller children, bedtime routines may be more challenging. So give yourself more time to aid in that transition time. Also, a tip is to utilize a hallway light so that they know there's a glow outside their door in case they get up in the middle of the night or they need that extra security. Charlene, I'm going to switch it over to our open paneling. I'm going to close our self-care portion, but leave it open to all of us so we can answer some questions.
Well, thank you, Jaymie. You have given us so much to think about. Really, really thank you. I mean, I'm sitting here processing, and at the age I am and thinking about losses, you've really given us so many great tips and words of advice. So thank you. We also have lots of wonderful questions that have come in from the audience. So we're going to do the best we can to get to as many of them as we can, given that some of them are a little bit long for the context. Okay.
Got it.
So this is one, Jaymie, that those of us who work with children and families in schools are thinking about a lot. Writer asks, many kids suffered oh, this is also related to your idea that grief need not be tied to a death. That seemed like such an important point. So many kids suffered milestone losses, of course, during the pandemic, graduations, birthdays, quinceañeras. Do you think that we should make up for these rites of passage?
It depends. It's some of those things or milestones are very time sensitive or time indicative. So when you talked about like a quinceañera honoring the 16th birthday, the 15th birthday piece and those time milestones, we can't recreate how time pushes through. However, we can modify and acknowledge. So instead of having a quinceañera, which I know is really important within particularly the Mexican tradition, you could utilize a sweet 16, which is a year later, and you can have it modified within that portion. I would say if you're going to relive a milestone, bring in the child's perspective on it. They may have outgrown or developmentally moved on from it, or life has pushed that forward. For example, graduations, huge, right? Promotion ceremonies, proms. How many of those seniors did not get their prom or a yearbook to sign, let alone? And so I can understand those are really big indicators for prominent parts of our lives. And a lot of it, even in adulthood, we think about it, and those are significant to them. And so we may want to think about, do they want something in, or some of them have already moved on or transitioned into their young adult life, whether it be through college or trade school or whatever they've transitioned into. And so it may not be as significant that they move through. However, an acknowledgement is always prominent, but I would factor in, what does the child want to do, rather than projecting what we know that they missed. Because oftentimes they don't know what they missed, depending on how young it is, but we know because we've experienced it.
Okay, thank you. That's
Mhm.
very helpful. So this attendee asks, one of my best friends passed away earlier this year at the age of 49. My 13-year-old daughter is her daughter's best friend. She comes over to our house a lot, and I worry about whether to bring up the loss of her mom or how she's doing. I think she may come over to get some fun and get away from her grief. Any thoughts or advice?
My first thought is, and I say this as kindly and as gently as possible, you're never going to remind her that her mom died. She knows. She really does know. And the reason I bring that up is because I have a colleague of mine, her name is Alex, and her mom died when she was 10. And she always found it confusing that people would never ask about her mom because they don't want to remind her. And she would always say, like, I could forget, like I can't. She would say it tongue in cheek. But the truth of the matter is you don't. It's how you phrase it. So it's not that you do say something, it's how you do something. So some wording you might find. So you're right. And you're very intuitive in seeing that maybe they're getting away or they're getting a break from the sadness of their home or just a different transition. So I want to acknowledge that piece. But something of how you might want to introduce this topic is if you knew her mom and the memory came. So maybe it's getting close to the birthday, or maybe it's getting close to Mother's Day, or maybe it's in the holiday season. You could use the mom's names or how you referred to them. So say the name was Marie. You could say, and the child's name we'll use is Jane. You say, hey, Jane, I was thinking of your mom, Marie, the other day. And I realized I miss her for a bit. I just was thinking about her and I'm wondering, how are you doing? She may say, I'm fine, and be done with it. And that's okay. But what you do is she may not disclose it, but what you've acknowledged is it's not forgotten, that you still think of them from time to time. And slowly, as you do that, you're building a skill set to bring even the casual remembrances. Maybe you associate hummingbirds with Marie and you saw a hummingbird, and it's one thing that you share in the signs, or it's maybe they may acknowledge, say, when I think about my mom, I think about, daisies or Gerbers. And you can do a non-verbal way of just having a bouquet of daisies on Marie's birthday in your house. So when she comes by, she sees the significance of the symbolism. So those are some of the ways you can think about it.
Really nice, Jaymie. My mother died when I was a teenager, and the worst thing was people saying nothing. But if they say, I remember when your mom did this funny thing, that's much more welcome, right?
It's gold because you didn't know that. It's just gold in some ways.
Right. So we have some questions about the appropriateness of mourning ceremonies. Let's see. For example, parent says, lost a grandparent during COVID. The child was not able, of course, to go to the hospital. My daughter thought that the 5-year-old was too young to attend a ceremony. Is that appropriate? And should you, as a parent, continue to remind that child how much grandma loved them?
Great question. So ceremonies are always at the parent's discretion. And when you get to a certain age range with children, it's usually around the 8, 9, 10 age range that you begin to open up the choice for them. It's about developmentally appropriate. Anytime you go into a ceremony and as things start to open up more, you'll kind of come into wakes or open casket situations. You want to give as much information as possible to the child that's appropriate. For example, if you're dealing with a wake situation and it's an open casket, you would want to explain what happens at a wake. So you can say, hey, Tim, we're going to go to grandpa's funeral and it's something that we call a wake and it's going to be what we call an open casket. Tim, do you know what a casket is? Yeah, they have their interpretation. You say, correct. It's a box. It's a wood box that we have. And what's going to happen is the lid is going to be open. Grandpa's going to be in it. And he's going to look like he's sleeping, but he is not. He is actually dead. And so what sometimes happens at wakes is some people will make a line in a procession to say goodbye to the person. Well, why do people want to look at grandpa while he's sleeping? Because, and you kind of go through that conversation, it helps them say goodbye. It helps them process that he's no longer with us because he's not sleeping, he's dead. Again, it's a very paced conversation. You give that detail to the child and you say, now, when that happens, you have a choice, Tim. Do you want to go up to the casket and say goodbye? Or do you want to maybe light a candle instead? Or do you want to stay with Uncle Bob over here and he's going to hang out with you while I maybe go up and say my goodbye because that's what I need? You articulate out, what are you going to be doing during that time? What are the options of? Day of, Tim may say, okay, I want to do it. Halfway in the line go, I don't want to do it. And so, which he has a right to change his mind. And so you have to be able to have an outlet and be like, okay, sweets, why don't you go see Aunt Shirley right now? Or why don't you? And then you give him an outlet and then he can decide accordingly because it may realize in that moment it's overwhelming. The key in all of this is choice to engage and choice to say, okay, I'm ready or not, and pacing. Because when the hurt happens or when the small tail trauma can happen is when they feel constrained or constricted in what they're able to do and that they didn't have a choice or an out. And so respecting the volition and freedom and free will that every person has is very helpful in that regard. And being able to, oh, I'm not ready for this. They may not know they're not ready for it until they're presented with the moment. They also may be ready for it, and that's okay. And they may say, yeah, it was fine. It was just a little weird. Like it's strange. And then it's just kind of it's normalized for them. So that's the pacing of it. Now at 5 years old, oftentimes what I have seen with 5-year-olds is they're very sensitive. They're very in tune that shifts have happened. And what I tend to see that 5-year-olds like more are stories more than anything else. I've seen that 5-year-olds, they want stories of the person, and they usually like funny ones that they can tell and retell that people will find really charming because then they like the feedback of charm. And so for that particular case with a 5-year-old, it might be really difficult or they don't understand what a hospital is or all those notions. So you can say, we were in the hospital and it was a little noisy and beeping machines. You could give a little detail like that, which helps them put some time and place in it. And then they might reenact with their dolls a beeping machine in a hospital scene because they're trying to interpret the data they've been given. All of it's fine. All of that's healthy. And so stories are what I've seen 5-year-olds really gravitating and responding to. And it makes them feel included in the family dialogue.
Absolutely. I like that emphasis on choice. So let's switch gears for a second to the teenage perspective on death. This is a tough one, but a great question. If a teenager decides to hide the loss of a parent from their peers so as to appear strong and could not go through the mourning process, what can be done to help this teenager? Can mourning later in life remedy the loss of mourning opportunity during the teenage years?
Great question. I'll use myself as an example. So when I was 14, my grandfather, who I was very, very close to, died by suicide. Changed my whole perspective. 14, my reaction to the loss was to act as if nothing happened. I was a straight A student. I was all varsity in all my sports, and I flew through high school. None of my teachers had any clue that I had that going on in the background. Went through college and I realized that things weren't right and I needed some support during that time, as well as when I went into Peace Corps and the like of it. The reason I put forth that example is because grief doesn't go away. It's not going to go away in any time. It's not something that just evaporates and evolves. It's patient and it'll wait. And it'll wait when you're ready or feeling like you're in a safe enough space to process. Sometimes the waiting looks really hairy from the outside. Sometimes the waiting looks like, oh, you're kind of self-destructing and you're getting really rigid, or it's that. But the opportunity will always present itself. What I found helpful for me as a 14-year-old who was going through grief, especially of a predominant caregiver, was having trusted adults outside my family that I could talk to. I was sensitive in knowing that it would break my mom's heart to know that I'm talking about my grandfather and such a harsh death that really happened. So having a trusted adult, such as her best friend, that I could talk to was helpful when I wanted to. Having a sports team that they didn't know and I can just be Jaymie and not be the person who had a grandfather die, like not be that person. That was nice. It was helpful in my identity that I was forming. So being able to compartmentalize that, I talk about this here, I talk about this here, and then just having someone remind me that you can always tap into support services here was helpful, because it was a seed that was planted, and then eventually stepping into it. So it may look like they're hiding their grief, but it also may be like that's how they're surviving in that compartmentalized way. And it allows them to take off the bits and pieces in time and process the situation as they're able to. So if it was harsh and it was something so sudden, they may need time to just open up to that slowly. But again, it's in their process and in their own intuitive way.
All right, so we have time for one last question. I think it's important here to look at the parent perspective versus the child's perspective. So this parent rise, I'm afraid that when my dad passes away soon from ALS, my teenage son will not feel or show sadness. I dread if he just acts completely normal, as if nothing has happened. And I say this because it would make me really angry and upset, even though I know people are different. So again, parent is going to have to process. Teenagers or middle school kids will have a different reaction. What should a parent do?
Absolutely. So I'll make a really brief spite to grieving has two different styles of grief. We have something called an intuitive and an instrumental griever. It's based on the research that was done by Kenneth Doka and Terry Martin about, do genders prescribe grief? Do women grieve one way and men grieve another? And the truth of the matter is we don't. We have these styles of grief that society puts expectations on us. I'm running through this really quickly because it's preferencing the answer. An intuitive griever is an emotive griever. They feel deeply, they express that emotion, and through that expression, there's social recognition that there's a shift in pain, and it's tended to. Right? It's what we expect from a grieving person. Show me your emotion. I see that there's an emotional response. I tend to it. Instrumental grievers are the opposite. They feel and feel deeply, but that is not how they adjust or relate to any changes and transitions. They are thinkers. They're heavy thinkers. So how they portray their grief is very action oriented. They're doers. They're the ones that are planning the funerals, picking out the flowers, running those things, doing art pieces. They're very much more constricted, and they don't necessarily show emotion. It doesn't mean they don't feel it. It's just not how they assimilate or integrate changes that have happened. Instrumental grievers tend to be a little bit more stoic in their grief, and they tend to actually be higher energy. They can't get slow. Grief is a very slow emotion. Their reaction to it is inverted. They get very peaked and hyper vigilant. They get almost protective. So the reason I want to say this is because when you have a young gentleman coming into his own, that emotive experience may not have been shown to him. I hope that we have more societal representations that it's able and there's more permissions for it, but there may be communications from other inputs such as peers or society that tell him that's not how he's supposed to grieve. So his grief behaviors actually might be protective. It actually might be more on the hugging ground or the checking in or the looking. That's how his grief might come out. And so why we may be needing someone to mirror our expression, our sadness as well, he may be showing it in ways that we didn't know readily available. So the reason I say that is because I would hope that however he expresses his grief, that you're able to know maybe in a different way, oh, when he got me my plate, or he got me a water, or he was trying to be helpful, that's actually grief on display. It's helping that transition and it's tending to. And secondly, as a parent, you can always ask for what you need. Be very mindful of it, but sometimes kids, in particularly teens who are very in their own world, rightfully so, need to be told what you need, and you can express that to them. An appropriate way to express it is you can say, hey kiddo, I'm having a really hard time today. I'm missing my dad and I could really use a hug. Do you mind, bud? And he can give you a hug. You're teaching him how to give give support. That's a skill you're actually teaching your child to do. You could say, hey kiddo, I've just been really thinking about dad and I've been wanting to play some cards. You want to play cribbage with me? It was my dad's favorite game. Let me teach you. Cool. Let me learn this game. You can actually show a little bit memory sharing of teaching them how to play backgammon or cribbage or an old card game that your dad liked to play. And then he can engage in that memory in a fond way, and you're passing on some memory legacy. So teaching kids how to grieve is also part of the process. And so as a parent, I would hope that you feel like you're able to do that, and also recognize that there are many styles in which grief gets displayed. And you can let it surprise you in that. That's a hard one.
Well, thank you, Jaymie. I really want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. So many wonderful questions, and I really wish we could have gotten to them all, but I want to be respectful of Jaymie's time and your time, the attendees. So we are going to wrap for tonight, but this is, again, the video will be available on our video library for free. And as Jaymie mentioned, you may want to watch some parts yourself when you feel up to it, share it with a partner, a friend, a sibling, or your kids. There were many questions today about children who've been impacted by loss, and we know that is unfortunately something that many children and teens have suffered during COVID. So thank you, Jaymie, for the inspiration and your kindness and all your wonderful advice.
Absolutely.
So thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. Take care and stay well, and we will see you all soon.